Hello, everyone, and welcome to this free webinar series presented by WePast. My name is Christina Ruiz, and I will be your moderator today. Throughout the webinar, we will stop the presentation to review. There will be multiple choice poll questions, which you'll be able to answer in the sidebar. Please go ahead and answer these questions as they come up. You will have about a minute to respond to the question before we go over the answer. During the webinar, please feel free to use the chat window to ask questions and discuss the topic. We will take time during the presentation to answer these. This and other recorded webinars will be available to WePast subscribers. Register through wepass.com to become a subscriber. Today's topic is titled Surface-Guided Radiation Therapy, presented by Mike Thalhammer, the Chief of Radiation Physics at Centura Health. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Thank you. I just want to say hello to everyone and thank you for having me here. I am the Chief of Physics for Centura Health out here in the great state of Colorado. I'm based primarily out of our Denver facilities. And I've been asked to kind of give a survey of topics on the implementation of surface-guided radiation therapy systems and considerations when implementing those systems as an SGRT program. Just as before we start, a few disclosures. I have provided physics consultation services to a variety of public and private institutions, including academic universities in the form of classwork, physics training, therapist training as it relates to SGRT, and I've also provided physics consultation services to vendors such as Varian and Vision RT as it relates to this topic. With that being said, we have some learning objectives that are associated with this talk. It is a survey of topics, so it's a kind of a lot of information to put all in one thing, but it will be covering the implementation of SGRT systems. We will talk about our experience and what we have currently at the institutions where I preside over, and also talk about the selection of a system and the selection criteria. And once you select that system, what the acceptance and commissioning would look like based on the guidance from the AAPM, and the implementation of that system once you have it commissioned in an implementation strategy for rolling that out in your clinics. We will talk about how we decided upon the system that we have, just as a way as guiding our experience throughout the talk. We'll talk about what is out there as far as information for you to make the same type of choices, making a plan as far as once you've made a selection of a system, how that is going to look as far as an acceptance and commissioning and ongoing process within your clinic, and then getting it done as far as rolling it out to your staff and using it, implementing it clinically. As an anecdotal estimates, I do this quite a bit over the last few years and teaching courses and doing trainings. How people use this information is very different. Most of the time, I talk to people who have SGRT systems. They've implemented their system based on imitation. They saw it at a site visit, or the vendor directed them to a user they felt did a good job at implementation, and they say, well, I want to use it for X, Y, or Z, and I'm going to do it exactly the way they did it. Other folks will read the instructions from the vendor. They have a more narrow focus. They've heard that this system is more of a breast system, or it's something else, and so they have a more narrow focus, so they read the instructions and they implement it in a very narrow fashion. Other folks will use the AAPM guidelines. They'll commission it out. They'll determine what the accuracy of the system is. They put it out there kind of to the staff and say, when you want to use it, let me know, with very little implementation goals in mind as far as body sites and types of treatments. And more, the bottom one is actually gaining ground on everyone, is a wait and see approach. It's usually purchased as a large scale LINAC purchase as one of the components on the LINAC. Or, now's the time to buy because we have capital, so they buy this thing, and months down the road, someone comes by and says, hey, what are these things hanging from the ceiling, and what are they used for? And that's when implementation starts, or that's when acceptance and commissioning starts. In all honesty, the getting you on your way type of approach to SGRT implementation is very basic. I mean, there are other people's experiences, and it's worth its weight in gold for what you want. I used to hear that free advice is worth what you paid for it, but other people's experience do guide you along your way if they have similar technology frameworks, similar goals in mind. Doing research and finding out what information is out there will get you a little bit farther, and game planning and doing a good, solid acceptance and commissioning. And then just having basic sets of implementation goals of what I want this to look like in my clinic will get you basically 90% of the way to where you want to be. So in this talk, we'll kind of cover all of these topics, and we will basically do it in a fashion of we'll see what I do at my centers. We'll do kind of a virtual site visit, which is we do a lot of those for particular vendors, and they come out and see kind of what our SGRT program looks like. And then we'll cover kind of the literature review and a system selection criteria so you can see what's out there and ways to set up a selection criteria for your centers based on what you have. We'll also cover the task group reports and what guidelines from the AAPM are currently listed for these types of systems. And then we'll give our experience and a successful implementation strategies that we have found both in our institutions and other institutions that have come to kind of see how we've got our program off the ground. So it is a survey of topics. So the first 3 topics, experience, selection, and guidelines, is designed to get your system into your center. It should be a general approach. I will be illustrating along the way with things from our experience. So obviously you'll see particular vendors as we go, but hopefully it is more of a general approach to get the system into your clinics. And then from the other side, we'll approach from a different direction and look at an implementation strategy that should be should be very based on site and the system you select, but it is an iterative process and helps you guide your department kind of down a road of implementation and adoption of SGRT. So quick virtual site visit, people come to our sites all the time. We use SGRT front to back through the entire process. We use SGRT on our Philips Big Bore Brilliant CT systems to do the 4D CT simulation portion of the treatment chain. We use Stellent injectors for our CT contrasted study and lap Dorado lasers to place IsoCenter at the time of SIM. People often ask why we still place the IsoCenter and Tattoo, because we do a lot of SGRT. We don't use them at the time of treatment, but we still believe that it's good to have it as a backup. If we were ever to lose a system, which hasn't happened in 5 years of doing this kind of full-time SGRT at all of our centers, it would be nice to be able to find IsoCenter without having to do a lot of imaging all over the place on the patient to make sure that we're in the right location, because we relied solely on the surface. Everything else is done completely within a contained, integrated chain of ARI and Eclipse. So the virtual simulation control of the lasers is actually handled through the Eclipse virtual simulation package, and then right on into treatment, image fusion, planning, verification, physics check, and on to delivery. So everything is self-contained from the point of CT onwards. All delivery happens on the Varian TrueBeam platforms. We use Varian TrueBeam version 2.5 MR1 with the HDMLCs and the MMI interface to integrate our SGRT technologies directly into the delivery platform. Our chosen SGRT system, obviously with Gate CT being at CT, is the Align RT product from Vision RT, and handles all of our surface-guided radiation therapy deliveries on the LINAC side. One of the things that a lot of people skip over in SGRT programs is the immobilization system, and this is largely something we all inherit as physicists. We come to a center, or if we're building a new center, we use what we know. We use the Orfit AIO solution, which stands for all-in-one. It is a body masking system. You can see there on the right that you can pretty much mask the slots from eyes to basically mid to distal thigh down to the knees, and so you can basically rigidly immobilize the patient in a large number of configurations. There's a large number of sponge configurations that also allow you to move the patient around and provide comfort as well as rigid fixation. They have open face masks for SRS and SRT. You can see the thoracic mask there in the middle for C-spine SRT or lung SBRT, and it allows you to mask and also expose enough of the patient for surface-guided radiation therapy to work. Some immobilization systems, like the BodyFix system, for example, you have lots of coverage based on your Vaclock bags and the cellophane and the hoses, and a lot of people like those. When you're evaluating starting an SGRT program, all of those things need to be considered because these are computer vision systems. If they can't see it, they can't tell you where the patient's at. And so some of those things need to be taken into consideration, what some people kind of gloss over as they start their program. Some people, when they come into our centers, or all people, I guess, when they come into our centers, they see this kind of tree of complexity of different types of treatments. What we call down there on the bottom is kind of the low-hanging fruit, stuff that's very easily implemented through SGRT. Things like standard breast and palliative and pelvis treatments are usually relatively easy to implement with SGRT. And then as you move up through the complexity, you can see things like intracranial SRS, functional treatments like trigeminal neuralgia, deep inspiration breath hold SBRT for lung, liver, pancreas, acoustics. So there's a vast array of things you can treat with SGRT as you implement your program, and this is largely what someone would see on a given day when they come into our centers. We do have 4 centers currently outfitted in the exact same fashion as what you've seen, all treating altogether probably about 85% of our patient census across 4 hospitals, using SGRT for some sort of delivery and radiation therapy. Some as low as 60%, some as high as 95, 97% of the patient census is being treated currently with SGRT. But all that being said, your process may look completely different than mine. You may have a completely different set of technology. And so you need to see who's out there using SGRT with your technology footprint. You need to review some articles, be willing to and find people that are willing to share their experience with you based on the technology that they have, and then choose a system that fits your needs as you identify them, which we'll talk about in the next section as far as the selection criteria. Once you have all that, you determine the resources and implementation strategies that works best for your center, and then you can move forward in selecting a system. The system selection process, why we chose SGRT for our implementations in our 4 hospitals here in the Denver area, is maybe completely different than why you eventually choose yours. I am a firm believer in telling everyone selecting an SGRT system is not something you do at a booth at Astro or AAPM. That's a great place to see them, and they give you kind of the flashy presentation, and there's models there that you can kind of see the system working on. But you need to ask yourself real questions when selecting a system, and not just go by the Astro or AAPM booth presentation. You need to ask yourself, what do you want to do? What are we hoping to add or improve to our process? Do you have an SRS program or a gating program that you want to bolster with SGRT? Are you looking to add a deep inspiration breath hold breast program, which even up until last week, new papers being released about how deep inspiration left breasts show significant benefit for heart perfusion study defects, going from I think it was 27% down to 0. If I may be wrong, it's a new paper. I haven't read the whole thing, but I think that was what was quoted. So there's a lot of benefit to SGRT, and what are we actually trying to accomplish? Are we just looking to add some setup efficiency and accuracy to our daily treatments? Once you know what you want to do, the information that's out there, how do you understand how other people are accomplishing this with the SGRT systems they have, and what tools do the various vendors provide to help me meet my needs that I've now identified, and how do I make sense of that information? A lot of times vendors will give you a lot of information that's relative to the hardware and not necessarily to the end user experience, and so those tools need to be evaluated kind of on a user to user basis and sharing experience. And then finally, performance. How does SGRT stack up for what I want to do? If it's a good technology, great. If it's not, then you need to look somewhere else. Is the system accuracy adequate to perform the desired tasks that I've identified, and is that accuracy limited in some way by a process or the accuracy of the system's performance in some scenario within my clinic? We did this. We basically sent out a survey to our staff and doctors and said, tell us what's important for you for SGRT 5 years ago. And they said, well, usability, obviously everyone wanted a system that was usable. Registration and analysis was more a physics and doctor consideration. And the gating, we were looking at deep inspiration breath hold programs and finding that the RPM simple vertical motion was not adequate for what we wanted to do. So we were looking for a true 6D gating capability. Usability, latency measures the system's response and is important for usability. You don't want something that's going to slow your therapist down or provide some kind of hindrance to them setting up patients because it's not fast enough responding to their motions and actions with the patient during setup. And it's also important for the adoption of the technology within the clinic. If it's not very user-friendly, you won't get a lot of buy-in from your staff. The registration method, again, this was a physics and physician thing, but understanding how the implementation of the registration algorithm is important for setting up your QA program and doing validation. A good example of this is rigid versus deformable registration. Deformable registration, which a background I have, not a lot of people do deformable registration QA, but there's a lot of different deformable algorithms where you're minimizing surfaces, energies between surfaces, or using radial distribution functions to kind of dampen local deformations from creating distant translations. And so there's a lot of concern there from a QA standpoint. And what am I seeing? Is it real? And so we wanted the registration to be something that was very solid, very well understood, and didn't have some of these hidden pitfalls. The analysis tools should be very clear and easy to use, and they should help you distill the information down into a usable form or an actionable item. It doesn't help you to get a lot of glut of information if you can't make a decision for your patient. And finally, gating. The system should be integrated into my LINAC. We didn't want a delivery system that was requiring a therapist to watch all the deltas and then hit the button as soon as the deltas went out. We wanted something that would gate the beam automatically and gate it on any parameter as it went out. If any parameter indicated that the patient was out of tolerance, we wanted the beam to be turned off. We also wanted to look at what do our physicians want to treat. Some physicians are like, SGRT is a breast technology only. Others wanted to use it for SRS. I know Varian sells the Edge platform as that's their SRS solution. So some people think it's only SRS. Some people think it's only breast. There's a variety of opinions on that. I find it funny that if it was good for SRS and it's not good for breast, our physicians, maybe I find it funny because our physicians always fall on the right hand side of this graph. Everything needs to be treated with everything we have. And so sometimes we laugh because we have a very broad scope when we go into projects like this at my centers. The next part, as far as selecting a system, is very easy. Take all that information, find what systems overlap. If you're looking to do research, if you're looking to do clinical application, all of these systems will have some overlap in what you want and need. And then you just basically start evaluating the systems that have the best overlap with your needs and desires. What information is out there for various SGRT technologies are things to consider. If you do a literature search for Vision RT's Align RT product, there's greater than 900 results. This information was updated as of fall of 2016, just prior to ASTRO. There's tons and tons of papers out there related to SGRT for SRS, SBRT, all kinds of different treatment types, outcome studies for breasts and SRS and comparison to other technologies like cone beams and KVs, and even accuracy measures against those types of imaging. If you use other names like GATE-CT, GATE-RT, and OSMS, they all, obviously there's more papers, but largely comparing that to all of the other commercial vendors. I think there's 2 other commercial vendors and 2 research-based systems, and I think there's even open source libraries now if you're so inclined to write your own. There's less than 100 additional results, and a lot of those are abstracts or kind of feasibility studies. There are some really good PhD thesis papers describing some of the algorithmic implementation of some of the registration methods, but there is about a 9-to-1 comparison. The ones that are written for Vision RT's Align RT product are kind of broadly applicable for some of the sites, but you have to be very, very careful in applying accuracy measures from one vendor's implementation to another vendor's implementation. So the papers on accuracy in comparison to other technologies are not, cross comparison to other SGRT vendors. You need to basically do that cross comparison on your own. The other thing that you might want to consider, and something that I don't give a lot of weight to personally, but I know some people do, is market share. The big thing that I have for market share is user support. Is there going to be people that can answer my questions when I have questions? And the other big thing for me, especially being out in the West where we have large geographic regions and dense population centers spread far apart, is am I going to have enough field service engineer support? If everyone's using system A in my region and I choose system B, is my system B FSE living one state away in Kansas? So that does, if it's a clinical implementation that you're looking for versus a research-based implementation, service time and uptime, that may play a role into that consideration, but that is there also as one of the considerations when purchasing a system. And that will take us, I believe, to our first poll question. When selecting an SGRT system for implementation, the following items should be considered.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Mike. The poll question is live, and you all can go ahead and take a moment now to weigh in and respond to this poll question before we go over the answer. I was just checking the chat, and it doesn't look like anyone has posted any questions now. So I'll invite you all who are watching to go ahead, and if you have any questions so far about the presentation, enter them into the chat window so that we can go over them either now or at the next question break. All right, we'll just give everyone a few more moments to respond and weigh in on the poll question. All right, Mike, I think you can go over the answer.
All right, so the answer is all of the above. It looks like about 90-some% of you are still awake on this Thursday afternoon, so that's great. But yes, all of these things need to be considered when looking at selecting a system. They all play kind of a crucial role in how you're going to end up rolling your system out clinically in the end. So with that being said, basically the 30,000-foot view of selecting a system. The system information is very important, understanding how certain features are implemented within your chosen SGRT system. Is the vendor willing to share information with you is very important. If it falls into one of the categories that has little documented or published results related around that vendor's implementation? Are they willing to share stuff with you to help you get a QA program that is robust enough to check their implementation clinically? And that goes directly to the availability of the information, as we talked about before, and aids in that developing that QA program we talked about. The process, understanding how the vendor system will fit into your process in your clinic is extremely important. Vendors have a kind of perceived, kind of an understanding of how they think their software will be implemented within a clinic. It's important to understand that the vendor's process is not always equal to your process. And your process will change when you add SGRT to it. And so as you add SGRT to it, your system validation may have to change. If you thought I'm going to do this as a breast type of treatment, and then you find out your physician's like, this is really cool, I also want to do SRS, your system validation is going to have to change based on that change in usage after the fact. So the vendor's process isn't always exactly what your process is going to be. And in the final analysis, what matters to your patients is why we're all here. And so we need to realize that not all features are equal amongst all vendors, and not all features will be used features. Sometimes you see the flashy presentations again at AAPM and Astro, and you think, man, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then when you go to a site visit and you talk to someone who's been using it for a very long time, they're like, yeah, we've really never ever used that because it slows our process down or it doesn't make any sense to us. Getting that interaction and getting user feedback from a clinical standpoint is very important, because some of the features we think are really, really cool end up not being used. And some of the ones we're like, I never use that, we end up using all the time. And so no one system will cover all possible use cases, but there's a lot of overlap between the various vendors and systems. A quote down at the bottom from Task Group 147, and its essential feature of the devices discussed above is that they are compatible with the treatment delivery process. For such systems, it's important for the radiation therapy team to determine how and why the equipment will be used, both for clinical and research purposes, prior to the purchase, so that the appropriate specifications and installation and quality assurance process can be developed. That is directly out of the guidelines for physicists, and so that's something that we should really take seriously when looking at selection. Sometimes we think we select and then we go to the guidelines and figure out how to use, and that's not the case. For us, again, highlighting this process, these were the 4 things that we decided were important to us, and I won't belabor them, but the gating is true 60 gating in the Align RT product. It does gate on any parameter. It also has a time parameter. So it is an almost pseudo 7D gating, where you can say if a parameter is out by so many seconds, then gate, instead of gating instantaneously, which is important for Linacs like C-Series Linacs from Varian. The usability software is fantastic as far as the layout is extremely user-friendly. There's no right-clicking and trying to figure out context menus. Everything is broadly displayed to the therapist and easily accessible without having to interact via mouse or keyboard. And they also provide remote controls for the software so that you can do everything from the patient's side while you're setting them up. You're not constantly leaving the patient to go click a mouse click or move something on the keyboard. The analysis tools are great from a surface statistics standpoint. It provides excellent actionable information for the physicians and for the physicist. It does have a simple export feature for your commissioning and acceptance testing of all the real-time delta values, which makes physics commissioning exponentially easier. And then the excellent customizable reports. The reports are actually very nice. We don't use a lot of the report features for our sites, but sites that have lots of documentation requirements for billing, it does make that process a lot less onerous on the physicist and the therapist. As far as the rigid registration, we've kind of beat that to death a little bit on the previous slide, but it does use rigid registration, which is what we felt was more appropriate, and it provides for some interesting surface analysis from day to day. So when looking for other points of view, obviously you're getting my point of view as a user of these technologies. That's why we went over that first. There are other communities out there, sgrt.org, which is the SGRT community website. They seek to adopt and promote the best practices for SGRT across all applications and indications for patient quality. They have a great section for papers. If you're looking for papers specific to SGRT, they also have forums that, as disclosure, I am one of the experts on that forum that try to answer questions. I hope more people use the SGRT community instead of my personal email. That would be fantastic, because you answer less emails that way, because they're in the forum for searching and looking for topics, which is great. And obviously the MedPhys list, there's lots more people now having questions for SGRT types of technology, and they're getting a lot of good answers from a lot of people out there. Rex Ayers comes to mind. I don't know if anyone knows him from up in Washington. Fantastic user, great resource for getting just really unbiased kind of, this is how I do things and this is what I think is important. So there's a few people out there that I really, really trust, and a lot of them are responding very readily on the MedPhys list. So there's some other good places to get some opinions as well. So let's go to the guidelines. Now you have this thing, it's in your clinic, you chose it, now let's get it up and running and determine how SGRT stacks up to everything else. The guidelines from the current AAPM protocols is Task Group 147. It's the non-radiographic radiotherapy localization protocol, or task group, I should say. It does a fantastic job. I think everyone who wrote that protocol should get a hearty tap on the back. It's one of the better written task group reports, in my opinion, as a clinical physicist. It does reference a number of other protocols, as you can see here. It does mention some of them in a way that some people think, oh, they mentioned it here, so it doesn't apply. I should go there if I have a CyberKnife, for example, if I have a TG135 question. There's a lot of tolerances and things in those that TG147 will back reference to, especially TG142. It references TG76, TG121 directly in the text. It also references principles in TG100 and TG40. Even though TG142 does kind of supersede TG40, it does mention TG40 by name, and also has a couple references to TG154. So it's a good all-around place to go to look and see what you need to do. It does cover acceptance and commissioning directly. It does acknowledge that there is an overlap between acceptance and commissioning, but it does make a distinction between the two. You have to keep in mind that acceptance only demonstrates kind of the functional aspects and the specifications of the software, while commissioning includes things like system accuracy measurements to a high degree, determining system limitations, and developing operational procedures and QA schedules. It does acknowledge that that overlap does exist, and that if you work with the vendor to do some of the commissioning during the acceptance, that's adequate, as long as you take adequate steps to make that into a commissioning step and not an acceptance step. There is a performance evaluation that me and my group kind of it's an evolving commissioning. It's a validation of the software analysis tools under many clinically relevant conditions. It's not directly listed in TG147. It's alluded to in a couple sections very strongly, but it's something that kind of people overlook. They think that commissioning is kind of like a LINAC. You commission it once and it's kind of what it is. But it's something that we'll talk about here. So talking about acceptance testing is pretty straightforward. The physicist should be aware of Task Group 147 prior to doing any type of acceptance testing, because you need to know what the tests are before you buy something so that you can make sure that it's going to meet those specifications. The acceptance testing should demonstrate to the physicist safety and reproducibility. Nobody wants a system that won't put something in the same spot twice. If there's any special purchasing agreement, if you've bought something with special hardware like a patient coach or remotes or something like that through the various vendors, you should ensure that those hardwares that you've purchased does interact with the software correctly and does do what you agreed to in the purchase agreement. The accuracy, this is where some of the overlap with commissioning comes in. There should be a basic localization accuracy test. It doesn't have to be to the level of precision, but you should be able to demonstrate the accuracy of the implementation of SGRT before the vendor leaves. You also need to be able to demonstrate that the integration with your LINAC, with your ROIS or your treatment planning system is also adequate and functioning correctly. There's a number of tests in Section 3B of TG147. That's the box down at the bottom there. The vendor should provide a specification for successful passing of these tests. The physicist should ensure that those agree with the intended use for the system. If you bought a system and the specification is 2 millimeters accuracy, don't plan on using that for SRS, whether you agreed to it after the fact or not. If once you purchased it, if you agreed to 2 millimeters, you're going to have 2 millimeters, and that's not an SRS system. Commissioning is then laid out separately in the report. Again, gives you a number of different tests. The integration of peripheral equipment is, again, notice an overlap with the acceptance testing. Spatial reproducibility and drift, and dynamic localization, accuracy and gating, and static localization and accuracy. All things that you need to be checking. Any vendor recommended testing that they put in there related to their implementation of algorithms is very, very important, but is not the only sole thing you need to do. Some people focus on that because sometimes the vendors want to do that before they leave for acceptance, and they think, oh, well, I've done everything I need. And then documentation and operating procedures. TG147 actually splits these apart into 2 options. So in the table, you'll see 7 options. Here, you'll see 6. I don't think documentation is done until you have operating procedures and QA procedures. I don't think there's a distinction. So you'll see 6 on here, you'll see 7 in TG147. They're all smarter than I am, so you can go with 7 if you like. TG147 also talks about daily, monthly, and annual schedules for QA, which is fantastic. They give you a nice little table. They can include some tolerances and things, very a la TG142 tables that you're used to seeing. I can tell you this is where I differ with TG147. Our daily here currently at all of our centers includes all the daily, monthly, and a couple of the annual items. They're loaded into a DICOM RT plan. They're accomplished in about 8 minutes, along with and in conjunction with TG142 checkout in the morning. just one example, I don't believe if you're using gating every day for deep inspiration, breath hold, or SBRT or SRS, that you should be checking it monthly. That gating interface, especially on a TrueBeam, lives on the stand. If you reboot the stand of your machine, because your microphone or your speakers aren't working, you're actually rebooting your entire gating interface as well. That doesn't mean you're rebooting the SGRT system. It's just rebooting one end of that connection, and you should be validating that daily. Our system, actually, we break out the gating as a special DICOM RT plan that does a certain set of steps, and anytime you reboot the stand for the TrueBeams, you always have to run that before you can treat the next patient. And so, again, this is their recommendations. You can take them, leave them, do more, do less. Again, it gives you some autonomy as a physicist, but this is what they recommend. And that brings us to our second question. Is it recommended that the physicist be familiar with the various TG147 tests even before beginning acceptance testing and commissioning on the SGRT system? True or false?
All right, great. Thank you. Mike, go ahead and take a moment now to weigh in on that question. And I know we have at least one question in the chat. How many systems are installed out there, from David?
I don't know exact numbers. I mean, I'm sure the vendors, when you're doing your evaluation steps, can tell you kind of their install base. I know Vision RT for a long time, just based on the literature review that we just did, has a far greater advantage in an install base, I believe, than most vendors. I think vendors like CRAD are making up some ground on them as more folks adopt them here in the States or overseas. And so you'd probably have to go to the vendor specifically to get how many systems are installed. I know there's a lot of systems installed that are collecting dust. A lot of things are being purchased as part of the Varian packages, as they've OEM'd the Align RT product as part of their platform. And they get installed, and a lot of people aren't even using them yet. I get a lot of people that come into our centers that have them and really don't know what to do with them. And so I don't know if, say, Vision RT would be counting those install bases if they were sold directly through Varian. So again, that would require you talking to both vendors to make sure that you got an accurate number.
Okay, thank you. And just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions about the topic, please go ahead and put those questions into the chat, and we'll be sure to answer them during the next question. So I think now would be a good time to review the answer for this one.
All right, this is true. We covered this. This is another quote directly from TG147 as well. It's recommended that the physicist be familiar with the various tests recommended in the commissioning section of the report to negotiate support from the vendor in conducting part of the commissioning if the acceptance does not cover these. It's hard to negotiate with the vendor after you purchase something or after you've started acceptance testing and commissioning. And so you really should read this report before purchasing a system. And if you haven't, at least know it when you're going into that process of acceptance and commissioning. All right. And speaking of commissioning, commissioning is a process thing. Computer vision systems see the result of your commissioning. We're all very familiar with dosimetry, mechanical, and imaging protocols that go into the commissioning of our Linacs. But computer vision systems are sitting kind of viewing the scene of our treatment or viewing the scene of our commissioning without a patient in there. And so a lot of times I'll get somebody that says, I have this SGRT system. When I kick the couch to 45 degrees, the system says that the phantom moved, and I know the phantom didn't move because the phantom doesn't move. And I'll ask them, well, when's the last time you did a Winston Lutz or checked your couch walkout? And a lot of times it's, well, when I did my commissioning, or maybe last time I did my annual. And so you really need to make sure that your commissioning is a very tight process and that it's very well QA'd because the SGRT system is seeing the scene of your treatment. It does not distinguish between a couch walkout and a patient motion. You need to do that as the physicist. And so having a very tight commissioning is very important with an SGRT system. It's not a standalone kind of, if I commission this, it corrects for all of the wrongs of the other commissioning. So as I said, commissioning and performance validation are one in almost the same thing. You can feel free to disagree with me. Commissioning, we've kind of gone over. Performance validation is slightly different. I consider it an ongoing commissioning. It should include assessment of the performance of the system under various clinically relevant conditions and is an ongoing process. Examples are, if you commission the system for deep inspiration, breath hold, breast, you have not done a performance evaluation for something like deep inspiration, breath hold, SBRT for lung. That reason simply being is you don't typically cone beam a breast, hopefully. And if you're doing centering of the couch on a la Varian Linac, you have a new set of steps that you have not validated the system against. Same thing goes for SRS in the base of skull and the high neck for things like carotid body tumors. Tracking the face is great for intracranial vault treatments, but if you're looking at something in the high neck or in the base of skull, the intracranial vault is rigidly essentially attached to the face, whereas the neck has inflection, and that that doesn't translate to that location. And so there needs to be other performance validations taking place. And so now we're going to go through a bunch of performance validations that you can make as part of your commissioning, but things that should be considered. So validation of the calibration process, the vendors have recommended calibrations and checkouts. No matter what vendor you have to calibrate a vision system to the geometry of the room. What you see there on the left is a plate that lays on the table at IsoCenter, and you use as a monthly calibration is what Vision RT calls it for their cameras, but it is a calibration that you need to check to see if you drift away from. It is called monthly calibration. They have put a time or temporal name on it, so you would think you'd have to do it monthly. My centers, I haven't currently calibrated my cameras for 24 months. It does not drift away from that. So what we do is we do a calibration verification every month, but we do not recalibrate because it is an interdependent step in the radiographic calibration. And so if you recalibrate monthly when you don't need to, you've now invalidated your radiographic calibration for SRS. And so all of that needs to be understood, and it does need to be extended because when you do the daily checkout, you're basically looking at the relative position of the cameras, not necessarily the true accuracy of the system. So I don't mind to know that camera 1 is not moved relative to camera 2, camera 2 is not moved relative to camera 3, but that doesn't tell me about the accuracy of the system at IsoCenter. And so we extend our checkout, as we talked about, using TG147 in a DICOM plan that actually checks not only precision, but also accuracy relative to IsoCenter and relative to all of our other imaging systems related to the IsoCal on our TrueBeam. That makes sure that when I say I'm going to IsoCenter with my cone beam, it agrees in my SGRT system, it agrees with my KV system, and it agrees with my MV system. It also checks all the dynamic tracking and latencies and obstruction tests that you're supposed to do for TG147 on a daily basis. And so we extend that using this is the Mimi Phantom you see pictured here. You can use any 15 by 15 by 15 cube or your favorite Phantom of your choice for your morning QA, but that is an extension of the validation process that we do. Radiographic calibration, again, is an interdependent calibration step for our cameras in the system that we have. The vendor provides a very highly accurately machined Phantom down to thousandths of an inch or tenths of millimeters. And so it has 5 ceramic spheres, allows you to take images and determine the 6-degree orientation of that Phantom. They also give you an idealized surface and say, line it to the idealized surface, take the images, and then do a radiographic calibration by processing the correction between the images and your mechanical calibration. It's a very elegant process. It's very clean and easy. The only downside we find is that they say if you want to validate that the calibration took place correctly, do it a second time. Well, if I give the same images to the same algorithm and get a different answer, I'd have other problems. And so we recommend that validating the system be more extensive. And we actually CT this Phantom, put an IsoCenter in all 5 of the spherical positions within the Phantom. And we do hidden target end-to-end tests, systematically offsetting and validating each individual IsoCenter, because that's basically how we would do a multi-IsoCenter SRS. And so we validate each 3D target position with a Winston-Lutz test, trying to keep that below 0.3 of a millimeter. System performance validations for gating and registration. Gating always is a great thing for our deep inspiration breath hold breasts. We usually validate it for breasts and SBRT. We largely don't want to gate ahead because it's not really moving, you would hope, but you can validate it for that. Anywhere you choose to use gating, though, you do need to make sure that you're validating it against both ROI size, which would be the dark solid purple you see in these images, not the dots or the speckled purple. The ROI is the processed region of the image, and the surface resolution. So each site has a different surface resolution. If you have an extremely high resolution surface and an extremely large ROI, the processing time goes up, frame rates go down, which means latency goes up. So just validating deep inspiration breath hold breasts, for example, gating, does not mean you're ready to do SBRT gating or SRS gating. Rigid registration performance, again, rigidly registering a surface to a rigid Phantom, not very difficult, very easy, very, very high precision. As you can see in this image, they're all zeros. We would expect them to match very well. You do need, though, to check at extreme positions, at the extreme edges of the field of view, because these are model-based calibrations of these cameras. So the geometry is based on a model-based calibration. And so the extreme edges of the field of view are places where you can find discrepancies, and extreme distances from the surface to the IsoCenter location. Some of that might not be clinically relevant for you, but we test things almost until we can break them, is our mantra. Usually, if I can't break it, it's not done correctly. And so we try to do the validate your registration method against extreme conditions. In this case, rigid registration versus a deformable surface. In this case, we have a bladder full of fluid. size of an average breast that we treat. It's full of fluid. It's allowed to fall on the table and deform in any way it wants. We then try to rigidly register it to its DICOM surface. As you can see there on the left, it's very easy to do so, all within at least a millimeter, 0.8 of a millimeter. We then mimic a swelling event where we inject fluid into that bladder. We visually inspect where the expansion points were by putting grid lines on the bladder. And then looking at the surface statistics tools, it's very clear and concise what information we're looking at. It says there's 69% of the points are within our spec. The red points are above the surface, which means it's swollen, and it's indicated the area where it's swollen for us. And so we can visually, effort is made to make sure that that is correct. In addition, we pull it out, mimicking a return to normal after a swelling event. We can then go back using the surface statistics tool. Again, the analytical tools they provide to you give you very clear, actionable information. It says 99% of the points are within my tolerance. Everything looks great. There's very little red to speak of. And then we go to a weight loss or loss of distension scenario where we remove fluid, and can we determine if the bladder has shrunk or deformed in that way. Again, surface statistics tools are telling us 65% of the points are within tolerance, but there are blue regions now which are clearly indicated on the graph that say those are below the surface and we need to take some sort of action. We use this on our patients clinically. I believe this tool, I am a firm believer that this actually saved one of our patients' lives last year, where we detected a severe weight gain over the weekend. She had no visible complaints. We mentioned it to the physician. He sent her to the medical oncologist, and he actually had her admitted for an underlying condition. She had no complaints, would have come in, been treated in any other place because it was a breast. We would have treated on tattoos. Everything would have been fine, and we would have not caught that condition had we not been able to clearly identify those types of conditions with this tool. SGRT systems on CT are another decoupled system. They're uniquely decoupled because they don't ride the couch like the ANZI belt, the Bellows system, or RPM. This is Emily. She's a very high dollar, high precision SGRT QA Phantom. That reads as a $10 dress model from Amazon, riding on top of my RPM Phantom that I got for free. If you put her on the couch, you have to tell the system, because it's not riding the couch now, how fast the couch is moving, which is based on your CT protocol. If you see the image up in the upper right-hand corner, that's the image because it's a single camera system. You can see portions of the chest of the Phantom are not seen because they're shadowed by the breast on the Phantom. So you can see that there's some missing information. That's important when putting in the speed of your couch, because if you look at the left, if I tell the system to track at a certain speed and the couch is moving faster than the tracking speed, you'll see a drop in amplitude. The reason is the amplitude towards the inferior portion of the Phantom is low. The amplitude towards the top of the Phantom and the superior portion is very high. And so if I put in a speed that's too slow to track, it will drop in amplitude. If I overcorrect, you see the second graph where the amplitude throughout the X-ray region, which is the yellow, is climbing, meaning the tracking is going superior along the patient. And then again, if I do it correctly and I put in the correct tracking speed for my CT protocol, everything stays at the same point, the amplitude stays the same, and I'm tracking the patient in the same location. The reason this is important is you don't want your tracking to fall onto an immobilization device, onto a body mask, onto a backlock bag, or onto a region of the patient that just isn't moving with breathing, so that you lose the signal in the middle of your 4D CT, which then ruins your 4D CT. The majority of people who tell me that they don't like their SGRT system for CT, for 4D CT, have never done this test, and usually what I'm seeing when I go to these centers is that the tracking patch ends up on an immobilization device because they have a gate or a paddle or something very close to where they're tracking the breathing motion. And finally, what we're going to talk about is treatment planning system validation in QA. If you look at the little girl here on the left, if I was to draw her in chalk on the right and try to fuse those two surfaces together, I would not get the accuracy I was hoping for. You need to understand how your treatment planning system, in the same way, is generating the DICOM surface you're setting up to, and what the statistical discrepancies are between the way an X-ray sees the surface and the way your surface-guided radiation therapy system sees the surface. The statistical difference, if you choose the right thresholds, should be very, very small. Ours are under a millimeter, but they do change with time as your CT tube fatigues and your Hounsfield units drift. So your CT QA and your annual QA is now playing part in your SGRT system QA. Before you ask, validation can be taken by far, way too far. I do not have patients that do this, but you will have this discussion with almost every doctor when doing SRS. If my patient does this and he will make one of these faces, what's going to happen? The appropriate validation step is to walk away, because in all the years I've been doing SRS with SGRT, I've never had a patient actively try to thwart the SGRT system. If I say lay still, close your eyes and don't move, they lay still, close their eyes and don't move. And finally, a validation of the treatment types that you're going to be using. If you are a believer in multiple MET, single isocenter validation, or treatments, validation of that, you can do that mathematically. If you look at the table on the right, the vertical column is the distance from isocenter. The column across the top is the rotational uncertainty around one of the three axes. And if you calculate a perfectly spherical target and a perfectly spherical dose and say, I have a 6 millimeter MET that is 2 centimeters away from isocenter, and I have a 1 degree rotational uncertainty based on the SGRT tolerances I have, you can miss up to 9% almost of your tumor if you have a 1 degree rotation around one axis. That doesn't include the other axes. If that same MET, that 6 millimeter MET, is 3 centimeters away from isocenter, and now you have a 1.5 degree tolerance on your SRS, which is what I see often because holding 1 degree is very difficult. If your rotational uncertainty moves out to 1.4 degrees, you're now missing almost 20% of that target. And so validating the fact that the system can hold the accuracy and precision over the entire treatment time for these types of treatments can be mathematically verified, but should be verified against actual performance on the system. Not just, well, I can hold it on a phantom, and so everything should be fine. I can treat something that's 12 centimeters away from isocenter with a very high degree of fidelity. That's not necessarily the case. And so with that, we're going to have another question. The question is, which of the following items, while important, are not directly covered in TG 147?
Okay, great. So that poll question is up and live. And just want to make sure that the chat is working. So please go ahead and ask your questions, or even just let us know that you're tuning in. So we'd like to hear from you. I guess if we don't get any questions for this pause, we're just going to take a few seconds to allow everyone to weigh in on the poll. And it looks like questions are coming, or responses are coming in. So we'll go over the answer in just a moment. All right, Mike, let's go ahead and go over the answer.
All right. The answer is A and D. The system selection and performance specifications are defined by the physicist with the vendor. TG147 can be used as a guide using those tests in there, but is not directly mentioned. And then system performance and validation, again, this is where our group and some others have decided that it's more of an ongoing commissioning, and so we've kind of added that. T147 does allude to that in some of the sections where it kind of alludes to the TG100 process, but it is not specifically mentioned in or covered in TG147. So our system, we wanted to do SRS with it. And so the career breakdown for me, these are the SGRT system, or I'm sorry, the SRS systems that I've used over the course of my career. I've been out of residency for 10 years. I've largely used a lot of these. All of them overlap with each other because of the various sites that I've either taken over or worked at times. And so these are all the systems. These are the things that we use them for as well. We wanted to see how SGRT stacked up compared to all those. I've done 10 of these IROC SRS head phantoms with my staff. The end-to-end test kind of that you do for your protocols and management of that, you can see that they are statistically identical. All of these systems did extremely well on this test. The percentage you see is the gamma passing rate. I always caution everybody from spiking the ball and saying, oh, Vision RT 100% pass. Those are on brand new TrueBeams, all of those SGRT systems, whereas the other systems are subject to the underlying LINACs, whether it was an EX with the Varian OGP, an IX with the Brainlab system, and I believe the FrameBase had both an IX and a CD, I believe, from Varian. The CyberKnife is the only one that is not a third-party system, that the LINAC and the robotically controlled system is all one system. So you do have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, that they are third-party add-ons to LINAC, so the LINAC accuracy is what you're actually seeing. And then Vision RT, compared to all of the other ones, as far as the end-to-end hidden target accuracy, this is the true 3D target position relative to radiographic isocenter, and you can see that all of those are within the TG142 1 millimeter spec for SRS, with the exception of the Varian OGP system, which was the one that was on the Varian CD system that's, well, at this point would have been close to 27 years old. And so that system is no longer also clinically supported from Varian, but just overall very, very close end-to-end accuracy. And so last section for TG-147, we'll do one more question. I know that was a quick turnaround. TG-147 contains and provides a complete listing of all system performance characteristics by which you should evaluate your SGRT system, true or false.
Great. So while folks are weighing in on the poll question, we have another chat question here. What is your QA tolerance?
My QA tolerance, as far as for my monthly verification of the SGRT system, I do a hidden target test end-to-end, ISOCAL, and all of that has to be around or below 0.3 of a millimeter, including imaging. I do a Winston Lutz test with just the SGRT system setup and then an SGRT and imaging setup. The SGRT and imaging setup is the end-to-end performance spec that we use because that's what we do for SRS. That is the one that's 0.3 of a millimeter or less. But if I set up solely with my radiographic calibration, only with the SGRT system, do no cone beam CT, I will accept out to 0.6 millimeters with the Vision RT system, the Align RT system alone for setup.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully that answers Scott's question. And now I think everyone's had a chance to weigh in on the poll question, so we can go over the answer. All
right. So the answer is false. TG-147 directs the reader to other task group reports where appropriate, such as 142 for mechanical tolerances and TG-121 for off-label usage guidance. It also refers to other principles covered by a number of other reports, including TG-100, while not directly by name. All right. So we've done all of this. We've got it working. We've commissioned it. It's where we want it to be. And now let's put it out in the clinic and break it. Because usually what happens is we've done all of our commissioning and the therapist find the one thing we didn't think about and use it for that. And so I am overtly familiar with this scenario. So what we saw in our virtual site tour of what we do here, we saw this wonderful tree of complexity of all the different types of treatments we're doing at our centers across our 4 SGRT-based centers. And everyone comes in for site visits and they see this and they're like, I'm going home, I'm going to implement his QA program, and I'm going to do this. The only problem is you see this when you come for a site visit. What you don't see is this. This is our SGRT implementation strategy at all of my clinics. This is also what I do when I give a seminar or a training for physicists, that a progressive implementation of your chosen SGRT technology, whatever vendor it is, helps in the adoption process and also helps you maintain a sense of quality throughout the adoption process. So 20% simple RT, breast, brains and pelvis, all of those we do will be post-installation and initial process layout by myself and some basic training. So the therapist will get basic training. We'll start with about 20% of our census will be right breasts and those types of things. Let's do those and not do anything crazy because we want to get used to clicking on the software, doing ROIs, selecting the right treatment sites, doing our QA checks for IsoCenter and all that. And then what we'll do after that, we'll go to a post on-site training. So I will either go out and do a training, we'll bring a vendor out for doing training. We will refine our process based on the input that we got from the first rollout. We will implement an incident learning system where as we get to these more complex treatments, if there was something we didn't understand, and then we then move on to the more complex treatments, SRS, SBRT, and deep inspiration breath hold, SRT. And this is post-departmental training where we go through everything again, go through the incident learning system, finalize our process. We've dialed in our tolerances, and now we have an incident learning system to catch all the outliers that we might miss. You don't see that on a site visit. You see that just everything magically works when you walk in. Don't miss the forest for the trees, because if you run through the forest, you will run into all the trees. There will be problems. You're going to have problems rolling it out because everything you thought of in commissioning may not be what the therapist thought of when they rolled it out in the clinic and started using it. So you need to have people from all steps of the process that are using the system agree to take part in meetings at a set place. I always recommend no phoning it in, at least at first, which is usually the most difficult for the physicists and the doctors, and then meet starting weekly. I always recommend weekly. We always do a Friday meeting on a rollout for the first 6 weeks of an SGRT program. First 6 weeks, we all meet on Fridays and air our grievances and kind of have the Festivus meeting about how much we hate this, and figure out what's going on and what's went wrong and whose fault it is, usually the physicist. And then we go to monthly, and then we go to quarterly as part of our ACR accreditation and QI committees. That helps you nip things in the bud where it doesn't relegate the system to, oh, it didn't work on the very first breast because we forgot to do an ROI correctly, and so it's going to sit on the ash heap of history until someone decides, hey, what do we use this for again? And so you need to basically be very deliberate of the rollout and also be very responsive to your therapist, very responsive to your staff as they have issues, because the issues, while you think you addressed everything in commissioning, are real issues that they're experiencing. And then from there, it's a simple onward, upward process. You identify new applications. If you did it for breast and your doc says, I want to do SRS, you do more performance validation. You work out a process map to identify areas of concern and where any type of failure modes could exist. Push a Phantom through the process with your entire team. That should be in red, very important. And then after implementation on actual patients, review the patients for signs that adjustments are needed. That allows you to constantly be adapting your process and constantly be addressing concerns and frustrations so that you don't relegate it to nothingness in your clinic or collecting dust. One good basic example of this is tolerance evolution. I know a lot of people, they put in the tolerances, the physicist said, I commissioned it, and here's the tolerances. The therapists go to try to set up using those tolerances, and as physicists, we measure everything with micrometers. So obviously, this is surface guided radiation therapy. Everything's a millimeter. I don't care if it's a breast, SBRT, a prostate, everything's a millimeter, and they can't set it up, and they're constantly fighting it, and they hate the system. What we typically do is take the opposite approach. We kind of open up our tolerances during that initial treatment time where we're doing easier treatments. This system allows you through a single click on a reg file to dump all of your all of your real-time deltas to a file for every fraction, and then you can statistically evaluate those and say, okay, on a right breast, we are routinely holding 3 millimeters throughout the course of treatment. Maybe we use 3 millimeters as our standard, and then whatever positives we get, if we need to back that off to 4 millimeters or 5 millimeters, we can. At our centers, we have pushed our breast tolerances all the way down to 3 millimeters, whether it's deep inspiration breath hold breast or just a standard breast or prone breast. But you can then start looking at making more accurate measures of what your tolerances should be based on the capabilities of the staff as they get better at using the treatment. You don't want to set 1 centimeter tolerances, and as they get incredibly good at the treatment, just leave 1 centimeter tolerances, because what you'll end up with is we got them into tolerance and then we took an image and we had to shift. Well, your tolerances was 1 centimeter. You got them just inside 1 centimeter, then you poured it in, and your doctor said, well, this surface guided stuff is terrible. I need to do 1 centimeter lateral shift. Well, the SGRT system said you needed a 1 centimeter lateral shift. You just happened, everything got green and you immediately took an image. And so you need to use tolerances to kind of drive quality in that instance. And so the last question for the talk, implementation of SGRT can be viewed as a process that, if planned out properly, should need very little tweaking once the system is operating clinically in your departments. True or false?
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. So that question is live, and you can go ahead and weigh in with your responses, everyone. And we have another question in the chat here, which I'll go ahead and read.
All right.
Have you ever had a change planning techniques for any body sites based on desire to use SGRT methods? Have you had any operational issues using Align RT with non-coplanar arcs and VMAT?
I have not. That's multiple parts there. We have changed planning techniques for SGRT, and what that basically, when I say planning techniques, is more at CT sim, the immobilization. So if we're doing a very high apical lesion in the lung, we know that it's not moving very much. And so we're probably not going to use SGRT for the gating capability. We're going to use SGRT more for gross motion underneath the body mask. So if you remember back to my immobilization system, they would either get a full head and neck mask with an open face, or they would get a full thoracic mask, which goes down about mid-rib cage and holds the chin up out of the field. So basically, you're holding the chin and the C-spine up out of basically the side of the apex of the lung that you're going to be treating, so you can come at it from many more angles. And so we do change the treatment technique because we know we're not going to gate, because we know there's not going to be motion there. In the case of, body sites, there's questions coming in and I can't read fast enough. Have you any operational issues with Align RT? I've not had operational issues per se with Align RT. I have had issues. I had an FPGA that went bad one time, which caused the way Align RT works in the 3-camera system is there's a master and 2 slaves, and you have 2 frame grabbers for 3 cameras. And so some cameras and some FPGAs do not play nicely as the master, and so we had to swap cameras until we could get the FPGA issue figured out. But operationally, it worked just fine. It was just that we had to change the configuration until we could figure out what the issue was. As far as non-coplanar arcs, we do non-coplanar arcs for all of our SRS. All of our SBRT have not had any issues with that. You do have to watch how you sim. So if you do an SRS with an open face mask and you do a very high chin, which a lot of people like to do for certain types of locations in the brain, if you do a high chin and then you do a vertex arc on the opposite, So basically your chin is blocking one camera because the camera can't view the face because it's tilted down and away from the camera, similar to what you saw on the validation of the CT, where you have no information from that side. And then you block the other camera with the gantry because you're doing a sagittal arc. You're basically relying on one camera. So we have a CT protocol that if you're simming anyone for SRS, you always sim in a neutral head position so that you're never blocking the camera with the anatomy per se. And so there are some operation things that you'll run into, but it's more of a procedural, how do I sim for SGRT versus the cameras just don't work in some orientation, if that answers your question.
All right, thanks for going over some of those questions, Mike. I think we can go ahead and turn back to the poll and continue on with the presentation.
Okay, so the poll says 77% false, and that is the correct answer. Implementation of an SGRT program should be a gradual, ongoing process. If implementation and review, where the process is refined over time, again, starting off with the simple, moving to the more complex, and by moving to the more complex, you're introducing more steps in the process, so you're going to have to refine your implementation. So finally, all of this sounds easy. I'm sure everybody's ready to go out and do SGRT tomorrow. If you have a system, you're going to go dust it off and just start using it. But what we've actually covered is just a survey and topics. It does take some time as a physicist to sit down and go through these topics and make sure that you have your end goals in mind, what your QA is going to be. And so what we've actually covered is what I do with my system and my technology footprint. Again, your system might be different. Your technology footprint might be different. And so your system is going to need some tweaking, but it's a general approach. We've gone through the selection criteria if you don't already have a system, things to consider as you go into purchasing a system, what you should evaluate with your team, what as a physicist should you know going into that. We've covered the guidance. We've done a quick review of what the AAPM says through Task Group 147 and all of these supplemental task groups. And I've shared a few additional extras that we have found along the way over the 5 or 6 years we've done this and implementing more and more complex treatments. And then we just went through a very quick overview of a simple rollout strategy to make you as successful as you can as a team as you roll this out in your clinic. And so with that, I will say thank you for your attention, and we can answer any other more questions on the chat if you like.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you all for tuning in. If you have any other questions, please go ahead now and put them into the chat box so that we can take a moment to answer those. And I think you got to most of the questions that are already posted. I didn't know if you wanted to go back over any of those or
yeah, I can go back and there's a couple here. Adam has a question. When you talk about distance tolerances, 3 millimeter for breast, what percentage of points need to pass? Do you have a higher required pass rate for more rigid bodied areas like skull and breast? When I say for 3 millimeters, you have a 3 millimeter tolerance on the window for actually being in tolerance within the Align RT system. You can, in the newest version of the software, have asymmetric tolerances. So you can say, I want a total vector displacement of 3 millimeters. What we say is it's 3 millimeter window around each of the parameters. So not the total magnitude. The total magnitude sometimes could be 5 millimeters, depending on how heavy of a chest breather they are. But if the vert, lat, and long are all within 3 millimeters, usually you get a port that is not distinguishable from the DRR. If you feel you can see 1 or 2 millimeters on a chest wall and you know that it needs to be moved that far, by all means, tighten up your tolerances. If you can show that statistically that that's what your tolerances indicate, then by all means you tighten your tolerance down as part of that statistical review of your tolerances. We do have higher tolerances for skull based on SRS or SRT, like nasopharyngeal, SBRT boost and things like that. We do have a tolerance of 1 millimeter and 1 degree for the majority of our SRS cases. For trigeminal neuralgia, sometimes we will take that down to 1 millimeter, half a degree. The degrees of rotation for trigeminal neuralgia, it makes you feel better to have a tighter tolerance on that. It actually makes no difference because in the case of trigeminal neuralgia, you're delivering a dose to a single point. And if you rotated that ball in any appreciable manner, even 30 degrees, it wouldn't really matter. And so it's more of a traditional thing, and we could try to do half a millimeter. The problem with half a millimeter is you do have couch walkout. And in our systems, I think my largest couch walkout at one of my centers is 0.3 of a millimeter towards the foot of the couch on the 90-degree side using IEC 1217 as our coordinate system. But we do have another couch that's around 4.5 millimeters. So I don't want to stop the beam based on my couch walkout. I've included all that in my QA. And so those are kind of the way we evaluate our tolerances. Jake says, how do you reconcile alignment differences between SGRT and IGRT? On our TrueBeams, IGRT is the gold standard. And so we know from doing our treatment planning system surface analysis QA that we talked about as far as looking at your treatment planning system surface, that I know if I set up using my SGRT system alone, if I do a cone beam CT, which I know is good down to about 0.2 of a millimeter, if I do a cone beam CT, I should see a shift no greater than 1 millimeter in the vert, 0.6 of a millimeter in the long, and 0.3 of a millimeter in the lateral direction. And the reason the lateral direction is smaller is because we're basically longitudinally symmetric as a species. And so essentially, we know statistically where our shifts would fall, differences between SGRT and IGRT. If I was to set someone up for a trigeminal neuralgia case and I saw something that fell outside of that window, I would question whether or not they were in the mask correctly or if there was some other underlying issue, and we would go back in and reevaluate the patient before we continued on, because the last thing you want to do is force the issue with IGRT and then have that patient having been in the headrest ever so slightly crooked, and then you kick the couch to 45 degrees, they relax, they slide into the headrest, and then all of a sudden the patient has a motion and you have to go back and do IGRT again. And so what we try to do is understand statistically what the offsets are at the beginning so that we don't have to make corrections in the middle. We rarely, if ever, have to make corrections in the middle anymore. We did it when we first started doing SRS with SGRT, but not so much now. It's an extremely rare occasion. Have you ever experienced your cameras fall out of tolerance and require frequent recalibration? I have not, but I've been called to a number of sites as a consultant that have camera issues. A lot of them have been related to the HVAC system. I've been at centers where they have a camera and they have the air conditioning vent directly behind the camera. So you are blowing cold air into the camera and you have thermal disequilibrium, which is very similar to what you would see in the morning if you shut the cameras off and then turned them on cold and tried to calibrate them. And so there are things like that in centers. A lot of times they are, I call them environmental issues, not necessarily installation issues, but your cameras are experiencing a real thermal problem. And so you see them needing to be recalibrated. I went to a site that literally couldn't hold a calibration for 45 minutes because every time they get it calibrated, the AC would kick on and it sounded like a jet engine, and the camera would immediately, you could just keep doing the daily and you just see it walk right out of tolerance just over a matter of minutes. And so you may have some of those issues if you have that and you see that it should be looked at probably. Do you have problems with DBIA? I assume that's deep inspiration breath hold with bolus fields, from my buddy Dave Heron. All right. We don't, but we have a process that we use for deep inspiration breath hold breaths if they have bolus. We are looking at other types of bolus as far as moldable bolus, but right now our process is we have a sticky bolus. The patient takes in, we set up using the free breathing scan. We then have them take in a deep breath and hold it so that they match the breath hold scan. And while they are holding it, we place the bolus on. If the person has a very gnarly reconstruction, as far as a very large expander where you have to really do a lot of taping of the bolus, you obviously can't have the patient sitting there holding their breath for 10 minutes while you try to tape the bolus. What we'll end up doing is have them take a deep breath and hold it, lay the bolus on there the best we can, kind of get it taped and take a reference, and then you can kind of finish the rest. And when it comes back to tolerance, it's usually not that far off. And then in those cases, we always verify either with a cine port during delivery to make sure the chest wall is actually in the correct location, or we will do a pre-port with an MV at the breath hold position where they match up to the reference and make sure that we didn't move the patient, roll the patient, or anything like that. Follow up on the out of tolerance question. That makes a lot of sense with our major HVAC system. Maybe that's a comment. But yes, HVAC systems can play a major role in these cameras because they need to be at thermal equilibrium before you calibrate them. Most vendors have a wait time. If you turn on the system, you're not supposed to calibrate it within the first 20 minutes or even use it clinically within the first 20 minutes. I have seen some systems where it's an hour. I mean, an FPGA is just an I/O board, essentially. So the FPGAs may have different environmental conditions. They may be made slightly differently. And so depending on your vendor and, the FPGA you got out of the box when they were making the camera, that thermal equilibrium may be different. I know vendors like Vision RT, again, because I work with them, they actually have a thermal system in the camera, which is really nice. So it basically tries to keep a thermal equilibrium with a heating element, which really keeps, that's why I think their cameras are so stable, and why I rarely ever have to do, if ever, do a calibration on them. How does the system react to weight loss in head and neck cases? Well, if you're using the system for head and neck cases, it's going to react very similar to what you saw in the bladder case. For head and neck cases, we do an adaptive planning technique here. We oftentimes will use a full face mask for, stage 4 HPV positive tonsils, which are, a vast majority of head and neck cases we see, base of tongue, HPV positive base of tongue. All of those things really melt away. Those are ones that SGRT typically is not necessary because you're given like 5 millimeter margins and you're in a mask and you shouldn't be moving that much inside of a mask. If you choose to use SGRT for your head and neck, so you have to be careful because the head and neck mask has an open face, but it doesn't have an open neck. And so you'll have some issues there. We've tried various different things. We always use open face head and neck masks if we're going to do an infield boost of some sort, or where we're matching previously treated base of skull or something like that, because we are treated like an SRS, but we don't routinely use it for basic head and neck bread and butter cases because it does tend to melt away. If you do that, we do an adaptive planning technique inside of Eclipse where we will plan on the first day cone beam, and then we plan every cone beam once a week so that we can see the dynamic nature of the weight loss causing different problems with the dose. I'd be happy to, if you want to send me, my email is in the presentation. If you want to send me that, we can probably talk about that, but that's probably outside the realm of surface guided radiation therapy. And it says, so do we need lasers anymore? I haven't used lasers probably in 5 years. That doesn't mean I don't think we need them. We use them for QA, obviously setting up our Phantoms. If the cameras were to ever die, and this is me being a worrywart, if the cameras were to ever die, if you only relying on the surface guided system, you basically get close and start imaging and get to where you need to be. And then you'd probably taxiderm the patient or put some marks on the patients using hopefully some lasers in the room and be able to treat them tomorrow until your field service engineer fixed the camera. I have never run into that scenario in 5 years. I've not even had a system go down on me in 5 years outside of, a flaky FPGA where they had to do some camera swapping magic until we got a new camera. But I still feel comfortable with lasers. I still do laser QA ad nauseum just because, that's the way I was trained. And it's always nice to have that as a failback. How does the system account for potential daily changes in patient clothing? You do not include patient clothing in your ROIs in the case of Align RT. And for cases of other vendors such as CRAD, where they do a full field of view deformable fusion, that will come into play. That's another thing where you change your simulation process. Largely, the patients are exposed because you are doing surface guidance. And so in the case where we do palliative cases, we try to pull the sheets down and make sure the ROIs are not affected by the sheets. But if the sheets are piled up on their knees, again, you're going to block the view of a camera. And so those are a lot of things that you have to do in validation. But we did have to change our simulation process because we had kind of an older center where they felt like, oh, all the patients need to be covered up once we get them set up and we only uncover them to tattoo. That kind of goes out the window with surface guided radiation therapy. Kind of modesty goes out the window, at least if it has to do with the treatment site. And so you kind of have to deal with that from a standpoint of that kind of knowledge, knowing that that's the way the system works. And then, does it work on hairy chests? It does, but you do have to account for that. If it's an extremely hairy chest, you're going to have difficulty. And so in those cases, we had an extremely hairy individual where we couldn't find an ROI site that was adequate. You would probably go to imaging on a daily basis. I haven't seen just kind of standard hairy bodies kind of affected, but I can imagine because you can't pick up even the fluttering of eyelid or eyelashes on an SRS. So we remove that from the ROI. So we're not processing that and getting fluctuations. So I know it can pick up that from time to time. We've not run into anyone where we had to be like, you either need to shave or we got to do something else. But it will affect on an SRS if you have a very large beard. I routinely don't include the mouth, but if they have, some gentlemen have beards that kind of climb very close to the eyes, you run out of ROI room, and we usually will have to ask them to shave at least down to kind of a standard beard level where we can get a decent enough ROI on kind of the cheekbones, bridge of nose, forehead, and back towards the temples. But, it's one of those things where you have to make a judgment call at the time, and that kind of goes into a protocol. Our therapists know they'll come and get me as soon as they come. We had a guy a couple weeks ago that had, just a full Santa Claus beard, and he was, in fact, a Santa Claus. And so he was not willing to shave his beard, and so we had to make do with kind of trimming the beard down a little lower, but not removing the beard completely. And so you do have to kind of deal with that. Do you still have couch tolerance tables? We do. I actually cheat and use my SGRT deltas for some of my couch tolerances. I use a statistical evaluation of my deltas from my SGRT system and pulling it out of ARIA and looking at the standard deviations of both and seeing how well they fit together. We can do that because the ORFIT system indexes to the table very consistently from day to day. It's a fantastic if you want something for really, 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 really tight couch tolerances. I've not really seen too many systems do better than it because of the way it's all put together, kind of like a Lego system. It's hard to get someone to move incorrectly on that system. But we do look at both. We look at the couch tolerances from a record and verify standpoint of what the couch actually was, because the patient can move independent of the couch and still be on in the SGRT system if you align to the patient. And then we also look at the tolerances of how are these patients moving and where should those tolerances kind of fall in between. I think I got through them all.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for presenting this webinar. And thank you all for joining us for this free event hosted by WePassed. Just as a reminder, this and other recorded webinars will be available to WePassed subscribers. You can register through wepassed.com to become a subscriber. And be sure to join us for our next free webinar series, Photon Dose Calculation and External Beam Radiotherapy, Part 1 and 2, with speaker Michael Fix on Tuesday, April 11th and 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And for up-to-date information about upcoming webinars, you can follow WePassed on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. If you'd like to recommend a future speaker, you can contact me directly via email, Christina@wepassed.com, or by taking this short survey. We're also going to have the webinar posted on YouTube, so look for an email from us that will have that link. All right, thanks again.
Thank you.